everybody. This is Ryan McClanahan with HistoryThroughCards.com. Hope you're all doing very well today. This is going to be a follow-up to my video on the 1973 Hobbies Act, and it's going to actually cover three specific agencies: the Federal Trade Commission, the Securities and Exchange Act, and the Internal Revenue Service, and how each and every one of these agencies may or may not play a role in the hobby. I'm sure there were a lot of very unhappy collectors with Congress when the Congress passed the 1973 Hobbies Act. They did not include sports cards, and I can see both sides of the aisle on this one. The collectors actually were complaining that they had seen a lot of forgeries come in through sports card shows, and the other thing too was that they had noticed that their cards were actually going up in value. This is actually the 1967 American Card Catalog, and it's the first one that was written after Jefferson Burdick's passing in 1963. The 1967 card catalog was done by Woody Gelman, or Gelman. I still haven't gotten that one down right, or whatever. So inside this, it's really quite interesting. The card catalogs were not published on a yearly basis, and so there is a few of them that have maybe 5 or 10 year gaps. So in 1939 is the original, and then 1946, and then again in 1953, and then 56. But the 1956 American Card Catalog is virtually the same thing as the 1953, and then the 1960 is when they totally revamped the American Card Catalog, and that's the last one. And then 1967, we have this one right here, and then again there's another one from Burt Sugar from 1975. And then there's another catalog which is right here, and this is from Dr. Jim Beckett and Denny X. And I'll get into this one in a little bit. What's really kind of interesting about this one right here is that the prices, and I'm going through just to tell you, the T206 in 1967, it is going for 10 cents each. The T207s are 35 cents each, and the T205s, where are those? Those are 10 cents each as well. And what Buck Barker had said in an article in 1962 was that he really did not want to report on values because he did not like that cards were really kind of going up in value. And Jefferson Burdick himself, he didn't like values at all either. He was really kind of notorious for giving away his cards. He tried to sell some of his cards, and it didn't work out. And he said, I'll never do it again. And these are guys who really didn't see the hobby as a commodity, if you will. But Preston Orme is really kind of one of the guys to press that issue, if you will, in the 1950s, and Charles Bray as well. And it was Charles Bray who first started the auction of sports cards in 1943 with the James N. Conklin collection. And Conklin was a California collector, and he actually had one of the best 19th century collections you would ever see in your life, and he died in 1943, and I'm sure he's got a lot of really great stories about collecting prior to its organization in 1935. However, Burdick actually knew that you would not have a hobby if you didn't have some kind of a price associated with sports cards, and I'm sure this was a bone of contention between Burdick and Preston Orme. And Preston Orme is one of our hobby founders, but what he did was he actually invested in sports cards in the 1950s. He had sold his stamp collection. He went all in on sports cards, and he really was at all these auctions, and he was just raising the price, raising the price, raising the price, and I'm sure it was to really kind of anger a lot of other collectors. And so in 1962, and Buck Barker was talking about the prices of the T206s going up by maybe 25 cents. He thought that that was absolutely crazy, because a lot of the T206s, even when I started collecting vintage when I was about 14 years old, those T206s were still very affordable. And in the 1990s, the late 1990s, in fact, I can, well, I don't have a very clear memory of the 1990s for reasons we won't get into here, but in the late 1990s, you could actually purchase T206s for about $5 a piece, which is what I did. And this was actually great for a novice collector like myself who really wanted to get into vintage. And I just grabbed as many as I could, and I think they were in like probably good condition or so, but it didn't matter because they were $5 each. So when I was growing up, I did hear stories about older collectors who are buying vintage sports cards, specifically your tobacco cards, your Cobbs and your Tris speakers, for about $60 or a little more than that, and I thought that was crazy, and so I wanted to double check to see what was actually going on, and this price guide is actually from 1982. And wow, it makes me feel kind of old because I do remember 1982. So in page 425 is the T205s, and what I am seeing here is that Tris speaker is going for $30 in mint, $20 in very good excellent. And on the other side here, I am seeing that George F. Graham, or Peaches Graham, his card is going for the same as the Tris speaker. Now, what's interesting about this is that Jefferson Burdick didn't really place any one player above another one in terms of rarity. You have some very rare cards and very rare sets that are priced not according to their rarity that he was aware of. I'm not entirely sure how he devised his system, except for the fact that I think what he did was that he was looking at coins and stamps as a model for how to set up a sports card price guide, because he's kind of starting from scratch here in 1939, and that price catalog of his was issued in June of that year. He actually had a few addendums. He knew that there was going to be more cards added throughout the years, and he actually allowed for other collectors to add to this catalog of his. And so you have a addendum, if you will, to the 1940 and 1941 and 1942. That catalog actually went out of print in 1945 when the last one was sold, and then in 1946 he revamped the catalog, if you will, and it's really kind of interesting to see the evolution of the price guide. When I was a kid, though, I relied on Beckett, and I'll tell you a little bit more about Beckett as we go along. So right now, I want to kind of tell you guys about these three specific agencies, and the first one I'm going to tell you about is the IRS. Prior to the institution of the 16th Amendment in 1913, the way that the government ran was through your sin taxes, which were your alcohol and tobacco and your tariffs. And the government actually tried your sin taxes back in 1861, 1862 to fund the Civil War. However, they found out really quickly that people weren't paying their taxes, and it was really kind of hard to keep track of who was paying what. And so that was allowed to sunset, I believe, right after the Civil War. They started again in the 1870s, and it was really a no-go as well. What is really kind of interesting is that they didn't have a income tax until about 1894 with the Wilson-Gorman tariff. This is Arthur P. Gorman, and what makes him really interesting is that he's actually a former baseball player. He doesn't have any other cards that I'm aware of. He may, but I've never seen any. This is the 1888 Presidential Possibilities set from Duke and Company, and I'll show you the back. It looks something like this. This is one of my favorite sets of all time. For a history nerd like me, I'm all over this like a bag of chips. Anyway, Arthur P. Gorman was born in 1839 and he died in 1906, and he became a star baseball player in the 1860s. I think he first started in about 1859, and by 1867, his future bride, or his father-in-law, most likely his father-in-law, gave him an ultimatum. You can continue to keep playing baseball, or you can get the girl. And he decided to marry the girl, and probably because she was worth a boatload of money. And so he also became a senator for Maryland in 1867 as well. And so by the time 1894 rolled around, the Wilson-Gorman Act instituted what a lot of people believe is the first income tax in the nation. This income tax was at 2%, or after $4,000, and it was actually declared unconstitutional in 1895. Arthur Gorman was on the Mills Commission as well, which was a commission to study the origins of baseball. However, he died before the commission could issue its report in 1907, and this report actually ended up missing. It was believed to have gone up on a fire in 1916 until it was found again in 1999 inside a box of personal belongings from a ball player who played in the 19th century, and how it got there is anyone's guess. However, Arthur P. Gorman is really kind of an interesting guy, and I'll probably write an article about him specifically, along with other people mentioned in the 1888 Presidential Possibilities set. This really is a fascinating set. Anyway, the Gorman Tariff Act was replaced in 1897 by the Dingley Tariff, and this is the tariff that banned baseball or sports cards or any kind of prize within tobacco packages. Within the Aldrich Act, you have something that looks like this, and I know this is a T207 here from 1912, and on the back of it, as I've shown you guys in the last video, you have this right here, which I know it's a little blurry here, but it says factory number 240, 1st District, Pennsylvania, and what that is a way for the Internal Revenue Service to keep track of all of its sin taxes and prizes and all that. When I looked at the Aldrich Tariff Act, I didn't see the reinstitution of tobacco cards at all. They just took out that portion of the Dingley Act, and they never really put it back in, saying that tobacco cards could now be issued within packages. So as I told you guys in the last video, there was the Commissioner of Revenue, a man named John W. Yerkes, who testified before Congress in 1908, stating that the reason why cards and prizes were banned from packages was that they were showing scantily clad ladies, and it was disturbing a lot of people, so they just decided, we're going to get rid of everything. And then again, it was brought back. in about August of 1908 with the Payne-Aldrich tariff. But again, like, I couldn't find anything stating that the cards were actually reissued within that tariff. And there's a lot of heavy reading there, so I don't want to go into it. I don't really want to bore you guys, but I actually did write a little bit about this in my look into the T206. When the 16th Amendment was passed in 1913, it called for a 1% income tax above $3,000 or more, which in today's dollars would be $88,683.35. Also, it was capped at 6% for people making $500,000 or more. And I can tell you there's probably 3 or 4 people in the country making that kind of money a year. And that would have been John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, or John J. Astor, and that was about it. The tax code was completely revamped in 1913. A lot of people say that the 16th Amendment, and particularly the Federal Reserve, has been responsible for a lot of problems in this country financially ever since. And some people say that it has been responsible for the Great Depression. I think it's partially responsible for it, but not 100%. You can also see that the value of our dollar has gone down since the institution of the Federal Reserve as well. Lately, there's been a lot of talk in Congress about this consumption tax, or this Fair Tax Act, and I'm not entirely sure that it's going to be implemented anytime soon. There are a lot of pros and a lot of cons to this. One of the biggest complaints about the Fair Tax Act, or the consumption tax, is that both the very poor and the very wealthy would pay the same tax for goods and services. I'm not sure entirely how this would be solved. This is one of the reasons why it hasn't been implemented, and I'm not a tax expert here. So, again, guys, I don't know if this thing would ever pass. There'd have to be a lot of things that we'd have to see going forward, a lot of changes to the tax code itself, and I'm not entirely sure that that's ever going to happen, because our friends in Congress, they really don't have to feel the same pinch as you and I here. So again, it's maybe pie in the sky that we would ever see a change in the tax code going forward. Right now, the tax code is set up in different structures or different tiers, depending on how much money you make. A lot of the disparities here between the middle class and the very wealthy, or the poor, is based on this tax structure. And a lot of very wealthy people, and middle class and the poor, actually have the same ways to make money and save money, but we're not a nation of savers. Well, maybe card collectors are, but not a lot of other people. So that would have to change. There are a lot of loopholes here that are intentionally left in the tax code for anybody to use, but they're not always used. And you have to have a good tax lawyer or a good CPA, and not everybody does. Not everybody knows tax code. And I found something very interesting in the IRS tax code regarding sports cards, in fact. That is found under IRS Revenue Code, or IRC 408M2. This is under collectibles that are of high value, which can be placed under a long-term capital gains tax rate of 28%. But why would you want to do that? Why would you want to add your cards to your portfolio and have them taxed at 28%? That is the highest marginal tax rate that I think you can have at this point. Now, the highest tax rate that we've had, the marginal tax rate, was back in World War II, and it was about 95%. IRC code 408M2 is kind of ambiguous when it comes to the hobby, because there's nothing specified here that states sports cards. It just states collectibles. Their asset is actually ambiguous at best, or inconsistent. There's nothing expressly numbered in IRC 408M. So how are sports cards taxed? And usually I think that the IRS would give you a 1099 with every sale that you make as a dealer, and that's, I think, how they do it. You can actually add sports cards to your investment portfolio, just like artwork and maybe a few other things that are outlined in IRC 408. I just don't see why you would do that. There is also a deduction of asset loss as well, and that is in IRC 212.2. The taxpayer owner has a burden of proof of expense based on factual analysis, and that the card shows production of income. That actually was instituted in August 16th of 1954, but again, that doesn't say sports card either. Is just really kind of ambiguous, and you probably could talk to the Internal Revenue Service and see where they're at, if that is actually going to be a part of a new code or something, or they're going to update it. I don't think that this is a good idea to actually implement sports cards into your portfolio at all. I think one of the ways they would add your sports card collection to your financial portfolio is to have an insurance agency look at your cards and value them. I think that they would probably be graded as well, because that'd be the easiest thing to do. I'm not entirely sure that an insurance agent would really kind of know what the grades are of the cards. They don't really want to speculate either. And so you might want to talk to an insurance agency on this as well. Personally, I'm not doing it. There really isn't any reason for me to do this. I don't think there's a whole lot of reason for a lot of collectors to add sports cards to your financial portfolio, unless you have, say, something like a 1933 U.S. Caramel Fred Lindstrom, or a T206 Wagner, or maybe even a 1952 Topps Mickey Mantle. Those are probably the rare exceptions. I'm not entirely sure either how the Internal Revenue Service handles NFTs. These are kind of things that have not been brought up by Congress or the Internal Revenue Service yet, but we're going to get there at some point, I think. Again, Congress really didn't treat sports cards as investments back in 1974, and I still don't think they do. I think they just see it as a hobby. And again, I don't really know any congressman who actually collects sports cards. I know a lot of sports players do, and a lot of fans and a lot of really famous people have sports card collections that they A, do insure, and B, that a few of them probably add to their financial portfolios. Do I think that sports cards are a good investment, or are they liquid? Now, one quick thing about the Internal Revenue Service and sports cards and sports memorabilia comes from an article from August 11th, 2007, and this was the Barry Bonds 756th home run ball and its tax consequences. Now, this comes from Paul Caron, and the baseball was caught by a then 21-year-old Matt Murphy. The IRS concluded, however, that once Murphy caught the ball and took possession of it, the ball became taxable income based on its value. They put a taxable income on it of future tax, which is really kind of, to me, very Enron-esque, if you will. Now, Enron, or probably more appropriately Andy Fastow, calculated future cash flow on something called future hypothetical value, and it could really be something that the Internal Revenue Service is talking about here, where the ball didn't really have a value at that point in time, but they taxed it on 35% tax bracket, which was roughly $210,000 on a $600,000 ball. Well, how would the Internal Revenue Service know what that ball was going to go for in the future to tax it then? This is really dodgy. It's very sketchy. Even if he didn't sell the ball, he still had to pay taxes based on a reasonable estimate of value, also known as the Enron hypothetical future value. Again, Enron is no longer in business, and neither is Arthur Andersen, their tax guys. That company went back at least 150 years, and within, I believe, 21 days or so, both of those companies went bankrupt. Whoever said there's no I in team hasn't read the Internal Revenue Tax Code or the 1909 Copyright Act. The team takes off and the I reads this stuff, and I do it for you guys. I don't want you guys to be reading this stuff. It is a severe waste of time, or unless that you guys have a very hard time sleeping. I don't think that the Internal Revenue Service implements the mark-to-market accounting as they just kind of said right here. I don't see that being very constitutional at all. So, maybe someday we're going to get a new tax code. In the meantime, the next one I'm going to talk about is the Securities and Exchange Act. Beckett Monthly was issued after Jim Beckett went to the National in 1984, and this monthly magazine was really revolutionary for the time. And what Jim Beckett did was he got all the statistical data to back up the prices for the cards that were being issued. And unlike what Charles Braid did, who got his prices from the auctions, Jim Beckett had a mathematical formula for figuring out what these cards were actually selling for. This right here was the April 1991 Beckett magazine. If I look inside this specific Beckett, you will notice here, here it is. It is the 1986 Donruss, and specifically Jose Canseco. Now, I have a really interesting story about this card. So when I was about 9 years old in 1986, my aunt actually gave me a bunch of packs of 86 Donruss, and I really was looking for Jose Canseco's rookie card, and I really liked that card. I always kind of wanted it, and Jose Canseco was a rookie then, and he was really hot. And so I opened up all those packs, and to my surprise, I got a Jose Canseco rookie card. Now, when I'm looking inside this magazine right here, I'm looking at the prices, and I remember this specific card in 1986 being worth about $90. And in this one, which is, again, April of 1991, this card is going for $80 to $105 and going down. And what Beckett was really famous for was the arrows up and down. And I think this is really where a lot of collectors started to think that Beckett was more like the Wall Street Journal and that the hobby was more like Wall Street. And I think this has really confused a lot of collectors and a lot of dealers. This is not really good. This is not good for the hobby. This is an unintended consequence of this magazine. I was so thrilled about that Canseco card that I completely lost the card. I have no idea what happened to it. In fact, my entire collection ended up getting water damage on it, and I stopped really collecting modern cards then. My modern collection at the time was destroyed by water damage, and I didn't pick it up again until 1992 or so, and by 1994 I was completely out of modern cards and going into vintage. Several years ago, I had the opportunity from a friend of mine to pick up all the sets from the 1980s, from 1980 all the way to 1990, and he didn't want them anymore, or I should say his wife didn't want them anymore, so he let me buy them off him. There are several takeaways from this specific magazine, and one of them is that the cards that I had bought when I was a kid are not worth today what they were back in the 1980s and early 1990s. For example, the 1982 top set at the time in 1991 was valued at $75 to $100. The 1984 Donruss set was valued at $235 to $350. The 1983 tops was $105 to $135, and let's see, the 1984 tops was $75 to $110. The 1984 Flair $120 to $180. 1985 Donruss $120 to $165. I think you can see where I'm going with this. 1986 tops is $135 to $190, and 1986 tops was $30 to $42. And let's see, there was the 87 tops was $27 to $40. I can tell you right off the bat, nobody in their right mind is paying $40 for an 87 top set. That set is as common as pigeons back then, and you would probably be paying $10 for that set max. Along with all those other sets, you're not paying what I just told you there. All those sets you can probably get away with maybe under $50 or $25, but you're not paying what the prices are indicating in this set. My point being is that in 20 to 30 years from now, the modern cards that you're collecting now are not going to be worth anything close to what you're paying for them now. They're actually going to go down, the majority of these cards. And my generation has already gone through this, and your generation, if you're younger than me, you're going to go through it as well. And what Dustin, the personal sports card dad, said so famously, I think, and it's 100% accurate, is that all modern cards someday become vintage. Now, with that Jose Canseco card, I actually repurchased that card because I like it so much. It's a memory for me, and that's why I actually repurchased all those sports card sets from the 1980s. I know that I'm probably not going to, I'm not going to sell these cards or the sets, but B, I'm also not looking at it as a financial prospect either. These are memories for me, and every time I look at the cards, I go back to my childhood. I had a great childhood. It was pretty fun, and baseball cards were a huge part of that. I think it's also generational as well. So when I did actually purchase this card, it was autographed, and it makes it so much better, I think, for me. It's a great memory that I have. I obviously don't have the original. I had it for one day in 1986, and I never had it again. But I love the design of the 1986 Donruss. I think that Donruss was really on the top of their game in the 1980s for their designs and some of their photos as well, especially 1984 Donruss, which at some point I'm going to talk to you guys about. But this is right now, I think, a classic card, and I kind of recommend it for your collection. Jose Canseco, he'll never get in the Hall of Fame, but he's got an amazing story to tell, and at some point he has actually told the story about the photo in this card, and it's really kind of classic now. I think it's really interesting, but he does have some really interesting stories about baseball and about the hobby as well. So that is going to be, I think, one of the very few junk wax era cards that it won't probably hold its value, but it's going to be a classic nonetheless. Now, why did I just tell you all that? Well, the simple fact is that the Securities and Exchange Commission doesn't view sports cards as a liquid asset, and specifically, a liquid asset refers to cash on hand and something that can be quickly converted to cash, stocks, bonds, or stocks. Security is specifically defined as an array of investments to include bonds, notes, investment contracts, And then you have control securities, which are held by an affiliate of the issuing company, such as a director or executive officer or principal shareholder. SEC does not consider sports cards as assets. They may be publicly traded through, say, the Beckett or PSA or whatever, or at a sports cards show. But when I showed you that Beckett, there is something also really interesting which I want you to hear about. Dr. Beckett probably took notice that collectors and dealers were treating Beckett Monthly more like the Wall Street Journal than a hobby, and he issued this in his guide. Only a guide. Beckett Monthly price listings should be considered as guides only, not as absolute fixed prices. These published prices are also not an offer to buy or sell on the part of the editor, publisher, contributors, or any other party. Beckett was not alone in that sentiment either. So in the SMR, which is the Sports Market Report of PSA, there is an important notice. It states, important notice, SMR is only meant to be a guide. SMR and Professional Sports Authenticator do not guarantee the accuracy of the prices listed in SMR. The collectibles market can be volatile and unpredictable. Short-term price swings are always possible. Professional Sports Authenticator, its principals and its representatives in no way guarantee a profit or a guarantee against a loss on any trading card or collectible you buy based on information in Sports Market Report. There's absolutely nothing in any kind of SEC report that specifically states sports cards, and I think it would have to state sports card in order for someone to be an investment advisor. I think that investment advisors can actually talk about sports cards and tell their clients, yeah, you can invest in sports cards, but we have nothing to do with it. And the SEC, as far as I'm concerned, they don't have anything to say about fractionalized sports cards. Now, what they may have something to say about is the stock from that fractionalized sports card. What the fractionalization actually does is it allows the collector to buy a small piece or share of the card. They may want to do this for several reasons if the card is rare or extremely expensive. Again, the T206 Wagner or the 1933 Gaudy Babe Ruth, those are extremely expensive cards. Not everybody can obviously buy one of those cards, so they would want to buy into one of the fractionalized services that can do that, and that's probably where a stock would be issued for that particular card. If you don't understand how an investment works, just ask Charles Ponzi or Bernie Madoff or Sam Bankman-Fried and his girlfriend Caroline Ellison. I'm sure they'd be happy to tell you. Personally, if I don't understand how an investment works, I'm not going to invest, and it is the safest way for me or you not to get burned. Buying and selling in modern sports cards has always been very hairy. You can lose your shirt off them. Vintage cards are a little bit different because the players are passed on to the Field of Dreams or wherever they go, and they're no longer active playing members. And so vintage sports cards are actually considered a lot safer. They'll give you more of a steady rate of return. Modern sports cards, you will lose your shirt most likely, and 90 to 95% of all the ball players playing today will be forgotten within 20 to 30 years, and they won't be worth what they are today. This has been played out over the last 60 to 70 years, so we have a lot of data on this. If you wanted to get into fractionalized sports cards, there are a few companies that actually do this. One is Raleigh, another one is Otis, and then Liquid Marketplace is another one. If you're going to do this, just read as much as you can and understand what you're getting into. Again, I can't stress this enough. If you don't understand how this stuff works, don't invest. And again, with the hobby, you really still need to do your homework and your research on sports cards if you're going to purchase for financial reasons. If you're not going to do that, you can still collect. And I collect a lot of stuff. I don't sell sports cards, and I don't make recommendations for the most part on what you need to buy and what you need to sell. My channel is basically an information channel on history, economics, vintage sports cards, and how they interact with society. Once again, the SEC does not require anyone to register with the Securities and Exchange Act in order to provide financial advice on buying or selling sports cards. It is up to the potential purchaser whether or not that is a good deal or not, and it's then left up to the potential purchaser and the dealer to make the sale. But at no time does the SEC have anything to do with the hobby at all. If it did, it would have required Beckett or PSA or SMR to register, and it never did. Now, the agency that I think has the most to say about the hobby and the issuers of sports cards is the Federal Trade Commission. So let's talk about that. A Federal Trade Commission has its roots dating back to at least June of 1900, when Nevada Senator Francis G. Newlands proposed that the federal government regulate business. When Newlands was elected in 1892, the Sherman Act was very rarely used, and in most cases it was always defeated in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court actually had said back in 1886 during Santa Clara versus Southern Railroad that the Constitution applies to business is equal to you or I. So Newlands really wanted to kind of change this, and you have to register your business if you want to do interstate commerce, and this is due to Newlands. Now, he was an avowed racist, and he tried to implement in Congress a law that would force African Americans to Jamaica, and obviously it didn't work. Both Woodrow Wilson and Francis Newlands have really horrible histories when it comes to race. I'm not going to get into that side of it, but Newlands was the chairman of the Interstate Commerce Commission. So in 1903, you had something called the Bureau of Corporations, and this was instituted in response to what Newlands had proposed in 1900. The first commissioner of the Bureau of Corporations was James R. Garfield, who was the son of slain President James A. Garfield. And what this agency did was to investigate whether or not these companies were monopolizing, and then to pass that information on to the appropriate sources. So it would be like the President of the United States or the Supreme Court, or both. This agency was an investigative agency. Whatever agents that this bureau had, it had to borrow from other agencies such as the Treasury Department to investigate these businesses and then report their findings to the President or to the Supreme Court or to the Justice Department for further review. Garfield opened an investigation into American Tobacco Company in 1907. He resigned, and the rest of that investigation was in the hands of Herbert Knox Smith, and that's really how the federal government was able to pursue American Tobacco Company, and in 1911 ATC ended up being dissolved as a monopoly. There are companies or monopolies that specifically Louis Brandeis had said that sometimes a monopoly is too difficult to break up, or we just don't know what the ramifications are of a breakup of a monopoly would be, so we're going to leave it alone. And this actually happened quite a bit. So there are monopolies that still exist today because we just don't know how to break them up safely. And this is just one of the parts of business. You can form a monopoly, you can form a business, but because they become so large that their breakup may be more costly or affect other businesses as well. So we just kind of leave them alone. And I'm not entirely sure what would happen if we broke up the tech monopolies now. The tech industry definitely needs to have an overhaul at some point, or at least Section 230. And you don't have to get rid of Section 230, but what you can do is amend it. And I think that's something that Congress is going to have to look into, or at least the Federal Trade Commission is going to have to look into as well. So there are a few duties associated with the Federal Trade Commission that have direct bearing on the hobby. Commission of 5 members. The commission will be composed of 5 members with terms of 7 years each, but they will be so appointed that the whole commission will not go out of office at one time, as this would necessitate the appointment of 5 men unacquainted with the work at hand, a condition which might seriously hamper the work of the commission. One of the chief advantages of the proposed commission over the Bureau of Corporation lies in the fact that it will have greater prestige and independence, and its decisions, coming from a board of 7 persons, will be more readily accepted as impartial and well considered. For this reason also, it is essential that it should not be open to suspicion of partisan direction, and my bill provides therefore not more than 3 members of the commission shall belong to any one political party. The salary proposed for each commissioner is $10,000 a year, the same salary received by the members of the Interstate Commerce Commission, and $2,000 less than that received by the member of the Federal Reserve Board under the recently enacted currency law. It is paramount importance that men of the first order of ability should be attached to these positions, and that service on this board should not entail too great a sacrifice to those who have served therein. Requirements of members great. A commission of this kind requires an unusual combination of qualifications. It requires not only a knowledge of finance and transportation, but also a very comprehensive knowledge of the practical, economic, and legal aspects of the whole field of industry and the country, and exceptional experience, training, and judgment. The Commission will have the power to investigate the organization, business, financial conditions, conduct, practices, and management of any corporation subject to the Act which they may designate. While these powers of investigation are great, they are greatly in excess of those possessed and for years of those exercised by the Bureau of Corporations. Reports are required from such corporations and classes of corporation that they may be designated by the Commission. There are over 350,000 corporations in this country, of which a large proportion are engaged in interstate trade, but the number affected by the proposed legislation will not exceed 1,000. In 1915, Joseph Davies reiterated the importance of the Federal Trade Commission by saying, Congress created it as an agency to destroy what has been termed the, quote, seeds of monopoly, unquote. This is clothed with the power to prevent unfair practices of competition in commerce. Unfair methods of competition have been in the past the principal weapons and of producing a monopoly. It is also clothed in certain cases with the power to serve as an advisor upon the fact to the courts and their enforcement of the antitrust laws. There is no doubt that one of the essential purposes underlying the creation of the Federal Trade Commission was to provide an administrative agency to make more easy the accommodation of business to the requirements which the government imposes for the benefit of society. I can think of two cases specifically that the Federal Trade Commission got involved in when it comes to the hobby. One of the most famous, I think, is the 1980 Topps versus Flair decision, in which Judge Clarence Newcomer decided that Topps was a monopoly. And I wrote quite extensively on that in my look into the 1981 season. There's a lot of sports going on there, obviously, but that, I think, that decision really opened the floodgates for other decisions going into 1985 as well. And you can go back prior to 1980 decision and see where, step by step that process has taken. And Judge Clarence Newcomer, I've talked about this, but he was really in tune to the hobby. I was pretty surprised about this. He said he was a card collector in his youth, so at least he understood that these cards could be worth a little bit of money. I don't think this is actually true for a lot of members of Congress. In fact, as I've said, I don't think there were any collectors of members of Congress aside from the ones I had mentioned. The 1980 Monopoly decision was really very fascinating, and I just kind of did a deep dive in that, and I've really found out quite a bit. That decision actually, that case actually, if you really consider it, went back all the way to at least 1968, and probably a little bit further than that. But the seeds were there in the mid 1960s, especially with Marvin Miller. You guys probably say too that Marvin Miller was great for the hobby and he was great for sports. I think it's somewhere in between. He's not good, he's not bad, but his decisions really affected sports cards, the hobby, and sports in general. And it's also true with Curt Flood as well. I actually happen to think that Curt Flood should get in the Hall of Fame. I think he has the numbers for it, but I also think that his contributions to baseball really maybe outweigh his on-field performances, and maybe someday that will happen. He's not really quite up to the level of Jackie Robinson, and for what Jackie Robinson, his entrance into Major League Baseball did for black ball players. What Curt Flood did, if you will, was to open the floodgates for free agency. Now, a lot of people say that's really bad for baseball, and we should go back to the days where you had one contract per year. Curt Flood's case did change baseball, especially the labor laws surrounding it, and I think for that case, he should be in the Hall of Fame. If Marvin Miller's in the Hall of Fame, I think Curt Flood should be there too. But you guys can tell me what you think about this. As you can see, I don't think that the federal government should really have much to do with the sports card hobby. I don't think it should be regulated, and it really isn't regulated for the most part. The only time it would be is with the Federal Trade Commission, and the other two agencies are extremely vague at best on what they consider hobbies and collectibles, in fact, and with the Internal Revenue Service, they just want money. And so what's going to be kind of interesting about that is how they view hobbies in the future, especially if it grows bigger than it is. And you would have thought that if anything was going to be regulated within the hobby, it would have happened already, especially with Operation Bullpen back in the late 1990s. And nothing has happened since. So I don't really expect anything to happen in the future when it comes to regulation of the hobby. You know, the government really doesn't do a whole lot well. And if you have it regulate the hobby, it's not going to do a whole lot of good for the collector. I think it's going to have the opposite effect. And this is a hobby that has created a lot of I get passion with collectors. I understand that. I see that on YouTube often. But it's also something that you can make money off of. I'm not saying you can't. You just have to really kind of be aware of the pros and cons of making money through sports cards, and understanding that this is only an alternative investment. It is not a regulated investment. And it's also a hobby that personally I have found to be very decent. It is something that I really kind of value. It has brought me a lot of enjoyment. In fact, that I get to not only collect a lot of great vintage cards, but I've met so many great people as well, and I learned so much. You should always learn as much as you can. And you know, one thing that I really kind of enjoy is not just making videos, because I may not be the greatest at making videos, but I do enjoy listening and watching other content creators and see what they have to say, because their opinions may be different than mine, and I don't want to be in a vacuum. I want to hear other people's opinions on sports cards or the economy or science or printing or whatever the case may be. It may differ from mine, which is great, and that's what I want to hear, a difference of opinion. And when it comes to the tech company or the tech monopolies, I think maybe those should be broken up or at least amended. Section 230 probably should be amended as well. And it doesn't have to go away completely, but it should be fixed at this point. This may actually take some time to do that. And you know, you don't have a whole lot in Congress that seemingly want to do any of this stuff. So even if a lot of collectors or dealers say or think that the hobby needs to be regulated, just remember that you can have any law on the books, but it doesn't mean that they're going to enforce that law or to have set aside money to enforce those laws. As we just saw, the IRS, there are 87,000 agents. That money that was appropriated for that is now gone. So that will not happen. And I think that's actually a good thing for collectors and regular people, because the thought is that having 87,000 IRS agents would harass regular Americans and not the upper classes, if you will, because you know, if you're an upper class individual, the chances are pretty good that you're going to have the money to fend off any kind of IRS harassment. But guys, thank you so much for stopping by. I greatly appreciate this. And if you have any comments or anything, I'd love to hear what you have to say on this subject, and whether or not you think that the hobby should be regulated, or what your opinions are on these specific agencies. And I will talk to you later. Thanks a lot again. Bye.